Welcome to the Social Workers radio talk show on WCDB Albany 90.9 FM with co-hosts Dr. Eric Hardiman and Alyssa Lotmore. Here at the Social Workers, we address issues important to our communities with social work students, alumni, and community partners as our guests.
As part of the University at Albany School of Social Welfare, we hope to take social work beyond the classroom and agency settings and directly to the public, because the public is the client. Catch us on air, online, and anytime.
Welcome to the Social Workers on WCDB Albany. My name is Eric Hardiman, and I'm here with my co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hey, Eric, it's the end of the semester, and that usually means student interviews. So that's what we're going to be featuring today.
It's student time here on the Social Workers. We like to talk to graduate students and find out what they're up to, both in the classroom and in their field internships, learning about social work practice. So we are really excited today. We have Melinda Haselton with us. Melinda is a graduate student here in the School of Social Welfare at the University at Albany. And she's been involved with a field internship project, which we think of as really innovative here at the school, and which involves her learning how to use the media and how to create a podcast episode of her very own. So Melinda, welcome to the Social Workers.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. We hope, maybe start off, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here to the School of Social Welfare and the University at Albany. What got you interested in social work?
Absolutely. Well, I decided to pursue a master's degree in social work after having a tragic event in my own life, which is what connects me to the topic that I'm here to talk about today. My husband died, and I was left to figure out how to handle my own grief and the grief of my children. And so I really wanted to be able to do something to make meaning out of my loss and give back. It was clear to me right away that I wanted to become a social worker and help others as I had been helped and held and supported through my own healing journey. And so that's what led me to this school. And I've been just so happy to be at University at Albany. It's such a wonderful program.
Oh, thank you so much for talking about this topic today, but I think it's an important one. And your project, as Eric had mentioned, you're using the media and public speaking to fulfill this component for your field placement. And tell us a little bit more about the guests that you chose to discuss this kind of hard topic and personal topic to you. You already went in a little bit why you chose it, but who did you speak to and why did you choose that person?
I decided to reach out to a few different people. I invited Dr. Carla Softka, who's a professor of social work at Siena College, and she's been studying death, dying, grief, and loss since she was in her undergrad degree in the 1980s. So she's been in the field for a long time and has a lot of experience working with many different facets of the field. And then I also spoke to two people from the community hospice, which is the organization in Albany that provides really excellent bereavement services for children and families. And I spoke to Ciara Deemer, who's the supervisor of the bereavement department there, and then Tiffany Smith, who is a bereavement counselor there who works with the children and families directly. And I wanted to talk to Professor Softka to get her, expertise and perspective on the greater scope of the concept of loss and grief as a society as we face this time in light of COVID and the last 2 years. But I also wanted to talk to Tiffany and Ciara to really ask them what it was like to work with people on the ground in bereavement services who they've been helping during these last 2 years, but even before that as well.
Sounds like this is obviously a very personal topic to you and one that has a lot of personal resonance for you. I would imagine when you entered graduate school here in social work that, you really maybe didn't think about using the media, didn't think about media skills, being media savvy, but that we typically think of social work as helping others in the community, and we don't think of things like TV, radio, internet. We don't think of the media as part of that process. So I'm wondering, thinking about your own personal experiences and your newfound skills in utilizing the media, what has this experience been like for you to not only record your own podcast, but also to be here right today being interviewed about this?
I just think it's really wonderful. And I'm so glad that the university asked us to do this, because I feel like it pushes us in a direction that we might not have imagined having to grow. And it's really important because while it's so good that we need to be on the ground and helping people in clinical settings and in groups and at the community level, we also need to really be able to speak up and be advocates and talk about the topics that we're passionate about and that we're fighting for, so we can educate the public, but also be prepared to influence policymakers. And this is how decisions get made, is when we stand up and make noise and let people know that these are problems that people in the community are facing today.
Well, you kind of already answered my next question about, will you continue to use the media? So things from writing an op-ed to being a guest expert on a panel or advocating to our policymakers. Will you still continue to do things like this after you graduate?
Absolutely. And I think it's just so wonderful that you're asking all these questions, because we as social workers need to really think about how to hone these skills as well. And for my macro project, I did a presentation for the New York chapter of the NASW on childhood bereavement. And so it gave me this really wonderful opportunity to have to practice this there as well, to create a presentation and to give it to a large group of people. They had over 700 people register for the event, and it's the most they've ever had anyone register for a chapter chat, which leads me to believe that childhood bereavement is a topic that a lot of people are really passionate about right now. And so
Yeah.
I think that I will continue to definitely do that beyond school.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You just used the phrase to make noise. That part of social work, and particularly in the future, is going to be learning to find your voice and how to articulate ideas and to make noise. Really, your phrase was interesting because it reminded me of Congressman John Lewis and that idea of good trouble. Maybe there's a concept we could call good noise, making good noise that would increase public awareness about topics and touch something in the public and help people think differently about something.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, I'm really excited to hear the podcast episode that you recorded. And for our listeners, after we are done talking to Melinda, we're going to play the podcast that she recorded and interviewed multiple different guests to talk about this important topic. So before we transition to that segment, is there anything that you would like listeners to know before they listen?
Well, I just would like them to keep an open mind. I think that childhood bereavement can be a difficult topic to talk about sometimes. As I was preparing for this and for my chapter chat, I would be out and about and run into people, and they'd ask me, how's school going? And I would say, oh, it's going great. I'm working on these exciting projects. And they would say, oh, what was it about? And I would say childhood bereavement. And I wish I could record their facial expressions. There was just this dead silence, because it's really, it's hard to talk about,
And what do you think that's about? Do you think that's about, sort of a societal taboo about talking about things that make us uncomfortable? Or do you have a sense of what that might be?
I do. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think that people don't want to think about children having to deal with grief. It's very hard. I remember when we lived in Connecticut for a little bit before moving here, and I took my daughter to this family bereavement group, and it was called the Den for Grieving Children. And I remember even standing there looking at the sign and thinking, wow, that is so heavy, grieving children. And I can really have a lot of compassion for people that it is so uncomfortable. And it actually reminded me of this time Brene Brown gave a TED talk. It was 10 years ago. So, just when she was becoming famous, and it was a talk on shame. And she said how that too is a difficult topic to talk about. But she said it was also the best way to get someone to leave you alone on an airplane. They would ask her, what do you do? And she would say, I study shame. And they would say, oh, and just look away.
But that is important. What you're just saying is that you're touching on a topic. And that's one of the things that I like about this project that you're working on. You're touching on a topic that people don't always feel comfortable talking about, or even finding out more information about, or knowing sort of the ins and outs of it. So I'm really glad that you chose a topic that is, as Brene Brown always says, lean into that discomfort, don't
Right.
just take the comfortable route. And I'm really excited to hear your interview with this.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And I think that it's a wonderful conversation, and we're all really passionate about the topic, and we really focus on breaking through some of those uncomfortable feelings and just bringing it to the surface and talking about how positive it is for children who have experienced loss to have these kinds of support and activities and peer groups and different interventions that really make such a difference in the outcomes for their life.
You're also, just listening to you speak here a little, Melinda, it occurs to me that you're also sort of really demonstrating the ability of social workers to take the personal and to connect it to the community. And so your own personal experience, you're an expert in this. You've dealt with your grief and your children's grief in a way that nobody else has, because it's yours. And yet using that experience, learning how to, developing a way to use that experience that will resonate for other people, that will help other people, and that will bring some light to an issue that is not often talked about. So you're role modeling how to do that from the personal to the community.
Thank you. I think it's just, it's been such a hard experience to go through, but making meaning out of it and thinking of helping others and helping other children just really makes me feel like gives me a sense of purpose, and that I can do something valuable from my loss. And my husband was a very big social justice fighter, warrior. And so I feel like it's also another way that we can really celebrate him and keep his memory alive as well.
So
Well,
it's,
go
go ahead,
ahead,
Alyssa.
Eric. Oh, no, I'm just want to say, I'm looking forward to listening to your interview, and I'm really glad that you chose to take this topic, something that's so personal to you. And as you just explained, a way to celebrate and also inform. And it's challenging. And I'm glad that you chose to do this one.
And it takes bravery. I think, talking about one's own personal experiences in a public sphere via the media in ways that, will be consumed, so to speak, by other people listening is a brave step. And so, I'm really struck by your bravery here. So great work. So you've been listening to the social workers here on WCDB Albany, and we've had with us for the past 15 minutes or so Melinda Haselton, who is a graduate student here at the University of Albany in the School of Social Welfare, and has created her own podcast on dealing with grief and bereavement, and particularly with children who are grieving. So we're going to air the episode now, and Melinda, would like to thank you for being on the show and for creating this episode.
Thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity.
Thanks for listening to WCDB Albany. Stay tuned for the podcast episode from Melinda Haselton.
Thank you for tuning in. My name is Melinda Haselton. I'm pursuing my master's degree in social work at University of Albany. I've spent a lot of time learning about childhood bereavement, a topic that can be hard to talk about, but it's really important to address now more than ever. I do have a personal connection to this topic. My husband, Dusty, died unexpectedly in 2017 Losing him propelled me into this next chapter in my career. I want to give back and help others through their challenges as I've been held and supported through mine. Learning how to guide our two children through their grief journey has made me passionate specifically about childhood bereavement. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to welcome our guests and ask you to introduce yourselves and explain to the audience your connection to bereavement work.
I'll jump in. I'm Ciara Deemer, and I'm an LCSW, and I supervise the bereavement department for the community hospice, which includes our pediatric bereavement programming.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today.
And my name is Carla Sofka. I'm a professor of social work at Siena College, and I started studying death, dying, grief, and loss when I was an undergraduate, and I guess I can say what year it is, although it's going to out my age. This was back in the mid-1980s, so I have been doing research and clinical work in hospice settings. I worked in a medical setting. I worked on the neonatal intensive care unit and the pediatrics unit as a medical social worker. I did a practicum in a funeral home, so I've interacted with families dealing with grief in different settings and have been teaching courses and doing research related to death, dying, grief, and loss for all those years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and for all your work.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
And my name is Tiffany Smith. I'm one of the bereavement counselors here at Community Hospice. I'm LMSW, and I primarily work with the pediatric focused folks. So kids, teens, and families are my specialty. And thank you so much for having us all here, Melinda. This is wonderful.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have this conversation with other people who are passionate about this topic. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think childhood and young adult bereavement is an important topic for us to address today?
I'm happy to jump in. I am obsessed with pediatric bereavement for all sorts of reasons, and Carla, you can jump right in, but the research shows that taking care of our kids in their bereavement time will be preventative for things like suicidality, depression, anxiety, low scores in school, having issues with their friends, bullying, all sorts of things fall off the map when you take care of childhood bereavement. And when a child's interface to death, it's an ACEs score, right? We all are so conscious of our adverse childhood experiences, and interfacing death is one of them. So tending to childhood bereavement can make what could become a rather difficult experience one that creates a path for normative bereavement for a lifetime, right? Like you get to intervene in this magical time where the next death gets to be one that's interfaced not as a trauma, but as a part of human experience when you tend to it as a child.
Yeah, what Ciara has talked about is so important. And I think it's also important for us to think about loss in a really broad context during this conversation, but it's not just the loss of a person to death, but there are so many non-death losses that kids face sometimes on a daily basis that are teachable moments and opportunities to talk about what grief is, to help them normalize the reactions that they're having and provide them with some strategies to cope, so that if a significant traumatic loss happens later in their life, they're better prepared and feel more comfortable talking about it as a normal reaction to human experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I throw in my own flair here sometimes. Like I had my best friend die when I was 11, and here I am, right? Mm-hmm. In it, obsessed with it, normalizing it for people, trying to make it death a human experience. And death can be traumatic, right? Like having a child die adjacent to you anytime can be interpersonalized as trauma, and it can be interpersonalized, like you, Melinda, had said, as a life path and one of wellness. It's like that Buddhist saying of life is joyful participation in suffering. It's being in it fully and joyfully and with the goal of togetherness and love.
Absolutely. One of the things that my daughter, who's 8 years old now, says is that she's really appreciated the opportunities to do activities to process her grief in the way that we have commemorated her dad at home and just incorporated his memory into our daily life. It's not even a thing. We just do it naturally. And now she and her brother are learning how to do that so that, exactly as you said, when they face later losses in life, which they will, they have this whole wealth of experience and these skills and tools that they can use that are really helpful. Have you been supporting people who have lost someone to COVID-19?
We have been, yeah. I actually looked at our stats from the last month, so March, and I think 12 out of our 40-ish referrals were from COVID-19. But we did a lot of specialized programming throughout the pandemic on just specific COVID loss. But yeah, absolutely, we have been.
And how have you found that bereavement services had to change in response to the restrictions of the pandemic?
Everyone has their pandemic saga, right? So we pivoted to completely virtual, 100% in the matter of, it felt like overnight, but maybe we took a couple weeks, and we just kept everything up and running, but on Zoom, just like we're podcasting on Zoom. We found a whole new world. One of our toughest pieces of our pediatric programming is our camp went virtual, our overnight camp, which we struggled to not be in person, and we weren't allowed in schools. So we serve a lot of our bereft children in the school setting. But I will say we're back, baby. We're back in the schools, which we're just loving. But thank you for that question. It certainly is poignant.
That's really wonderful. And Professor Sofka, you've centered some of your research on how teens and young adults have used technology and social media in their responses to grief. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think social media and technology come into play in so many ways, all the way from how somebody finds out about a loss, because I think we have to acknowledge that kids need to be kind of coached and taught about how news gets delivered these days, because they can have a significant role in either helping that to happen in an effective way or sometimes contributing to distress and further trauma. So I think one of the things I've learned is that there's this whole netiquette or social rules that are evolving about how technology is used to cope with grief. And I would really encourage parents to talk with their kids. The minute they have a cell phone, they have a responsibility to be educated about how they share information and news. So it goes all the way from death notification, how we find out about a loss and handling that in a responsible way. Because I think you can have a conversation with someone who's old enough to talk on a phone or to text and say, if something bad happens, how would you prefer to find out about this? And then when they step back and say, well, I'd really like to hear about it in person from someone who's in the room with me, they might stop and hesitate before they fire out a text and say, hey, did you hear what happened? But I think we also have to realize that sometimes when death happens in a sudden, unexpected way, teenagers turn to technology to get information and facts. And I learned in my research that when there was a car accident that unfortunately took 2 lives of local high school students and significantly injured 2 others, the students that participated in this research educated us that about 40% of them found out by texting and process of elimination who didn't answer the text messages. They figured out very quickly who had been in that vehicle, to the extent that one of the moms told me that about 30 people unrelated to someone in the car showed up at the emergency room before one of the moms got there. So news travels at the speed of light, but I think we have to think very carefully about what the consequences of that are and to teach people. So one of the resources that I created is this guide to netiquette. It's about 5 pages now that talks about all things from death notification to rituals that happen online and sharing information on social media, which can be both wonderful and challenging, because there's this community of emotional support that can evolve on social media, whether that's sharing stories and posting pictures and all kinds of ways that we help each other cope with loss. But sometimes that's done in a way that's harmful or hurtful to people that don't particularly like to be public about their grief. So Zoom can be used to create rituals, which I think it's really important for us to realize once the pandemic slows down and allows us to get back in person, we shouldn't necessarily forget about the availability of these things, because it can bridge distance and time and, people not having to get on a plane to be in the same space, even if it's virtual, to help each other cope with loss. So it's just a fascinating way to think about providing support in a less traditional way.
Yes, and it's just really uncharted territory. So we're all learning together. And so I can imagine for the young adults, they're really carrying this burden and probably making mistakes and learning from them, but also benefiting, like you said, from some of the shared opportunities to mourn together and to commemorate people they love who have died. And what are some examples of the ways that it's been positive for them to have this opportunity to share on social media?
Well, I think they discover that they're not alone, and that's really important. Although there are some people who might reach out and not get a response, so that's kind of a double-edged sword. Because if somebody reaches out and nobody responds at all or in a helpful way, that's not necessarily going to be perceived as helpful. I think the other thing that happens is people normalize their experiences, and to know that you're not alone, but also to know that what's happening to you happens to other people can be incredibly reassuring. I can't tell you how many people would ask me, am I losing my mind? And, am I going crazy? And it's like, well, if other people tell you it's happened to them, then no, you're not. So, and I, you can't see us shaking our heads, but we're all shaking our heads that this is something that's very positive.
It's really true. And that's the thing that I think a lot of adults seek out, the, grief support groups for themselves. And it's really important to emphasize how important that is for children of all ages, the young ones and all the way up to young adults. They need that peer support and that shared interest to really, they can bond with each other and not feel so alone or crazy sometimes in their thoughts and reactions to their losses. So that's really wonderful. Tiffany, can you tell me some of the ways that you support kids in their grief based on their developmental stage? Maybe starting with the young children. What are their activities and ways that you can support young children through grief?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the little ones, the little infants up to toddler age, lots and lots of snuggles, lots and lots of love, lots of hugs. They don't understand what the loss is, or they may not even know that the loss happened. But you may see that they're, a little extra clingy, or they're just a little not like themselves. And so just really kind of giving them a little extra love and attention, because really, who doesn't love extra love and attention? Like, everybody can benefit from that. Like, that's wonderful. Like the preschool to school age kids, they don't understand the concept of death being permanent. And so that's where you'll find yourself repeating to, the child, Daddy died last night, Daddy died last month, Daddy died 2 months ago. As hard as it is to say those words to the kids, it's something that you have to do to help them understand what happened. And again, lots of snuggles, lots of hugs, routines. Like, if they had been going to soccer practice every Wednesday at 4, continue with the soccer practice every Wednesday at 4. Keeping things structured, keeping things as quote unquote normal as possible, definitely help with their understanding and ability to kind of grieve the loss. Play therapy also is helpful. Expressive arts, I'm all for, just letting kids draw and movement, any sort of movement therapy, for kids of any age. I like to ask, like, if you were happy, how would you dance? If you're sad, how would you dance? And just kind of letting the kids work through that on their own, because it's fun and they're moving, and kids like to move, and it helps release all of the the stuckness in their bodies. With the, school age kids, still with the same routine, lots of love, lots of snuggles for everybody. They're getting towards understanding that concept of death being permanent, but they may start being concerned about, well, if dad died, is mom going to die? And if mom dies, then who's going to take care of me? And if that person dies, then who's going to take care of me? And what about after? And just, it may keep going and going. And so just reassuring them that there's always going to be someone to take care of you as far out as they need to go. Helping them to, draw their emotions, or letting them, I don't know, if they are really angry, like just screaming, just like get it out. Kind of following their lead and listening and being open to what they're saying, and letting them feel whatever they're feeling, and not telling them that they shouldn't be, or they should be strong for somebody else. And also, if you're the parent of a grieving child, it's okay to show your own emotions around the child and to do things with them. So you can have, Thursday afternoons, we'll sit on the couch and talk about that, and we'll share memories, and then we'll cry, and then we'll hug it out, and then we'll make dad's favorite dinner, and just finding ways to stay connected to the person who died while also being true to how you're feeling, how the child's feeling, and finding ways to kind of move forward together. Teens are teens. Teens, can be moody on their own. So when you add in this grief component, you're just makes things a little more difficult. But I love the teens because they are able to more concretely verbalize how they're feeling and more concretely understand what they're feeling too. And so things I like to do with them are this concept of what I call a brain dump, where literally they just take a piece of paper and a marker or pen and just start writing whatever's in their head and just get it all out. And then I tell them to either rip it up, tear it up, throw it away. If you have a fireplace, you can put it in the fireplace and burn it and just kind of let it go. Same thing if they are, living in a space where there's aren't neighbors close by, go outside and scream if you need to scream. Otherwise, scream into your pillow. Like, do things that help you release that emotion. Structure and routine is important for them as well. Lots of love, lots of snuggles, same thing. Giving them space. Teens like space to begin with. So just letting them kind of have more space if they need to. And, if you feel like they're pushing you away, just sit quietly next to them. Say, I'm going to watch this movie. Would you like to join me? Just finding ways to connect with them in a low pressure way where they're not necessarily having to talk about their feelings or what happened, but it allows that to happen if they are so inclined or interested in doing so. If you just show up for any age group, just show up, let them know that you care, that you're there. That's half the battle. These kids just want to know that they're loved, that someone is there to care for them, regardless of their age. I think we all want to know that we're loved and there's people that care about us. And so when people show up for us in whatever way that looks like, it just makes us feel more secure and able to deal with how we're feeling.
That's great. And I totally agree. I think that people worry that they won't get it right or that they should understand everything and be a grief expert. But really, it's just that human connection and showing up and being responsive to what the child needs in that moment. And as they're adjusting to their new world and their loss, it takes time. One of the things that I've noticed is there's a lot of resources that are focused on supporting children and youth in the early stages of grief, which makes a lot of sense. There should be, because that's obviously, the time where everything's destabilized and they really need that level of support and attention. And I would also love to talk about what happens supporting children and youth as they mature. And, they're not in the early stages of their grief anymore, but they're older. And, each year leading up to the anniversary of my husband's passing, my daughter is a year older and she has more questions and understands it in another level. So I see it happening with her. And I'm sure that you have people who come in who've lost people a long time ago. Professor Sofka and I were actually talking about this when we met a few weeks ago, and she shared with me the term STUG, which I hadn't heard before, sudden temporary upsurge of grief. And I really liked that. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Carla.
A STUG reaction or a subsequent temporary upsurge of grief is when that grief comes back, and it's often triggered by different things. It can be a date on a calendar. You mentioned the anniversary of a death. It can be the person's birthday. It can be a holiday time, seasonal times of year that hold significance or special meaning when the person is not present. It can also be a sight, a sound, a smell. Seeing, I was telling Melinda in our conversation, I can't go by a bakery and see snickerdoodles without remembering my grandmother's kitchen and missing her. And for some people, it's a cologne, or some people, it's hearing a song on the radio that has special significance. And some of those are predictable, which means you might be able to anticipate that's going to happen. And sometimes the anticipation is actually harder than when it hits, because you're not sure how you're going to react. So I think just being aware of times of year, dates on the calendar, and if somebody says to you, I feel sad or I'm upset, but I can't figure out why, those are great questions to ask. Is there something coming up that reminds you of someone? Did something happen to you that brought back a memory? And then it opens up that dialogue and conversation to say, hey, this is normal. There's actually a term for that. And, people's faces just kind of light up, and you can see the relief when you say, oh, there's a clinical term for that, because that means it's normal. And so understanding those kinds of things can happen. It can also happen around milestones in life. You were talking, Tiffany, about, as people grow older, the grief can come back, and that's just a linear correspondence reaction is the technical term for that. So as people graduate from high school, they're going to miss having someone around, or when they get married, or when they have their first child. All of these developmental milestones are times when people might re-grieve a loss, and just being aware of that is so important.
I love that so much, Carla. I'm just going to jump in. I think of these upsurges as a way, if you want to have the person be reconnected with your current status, your current place in life, right? So if it's high school graduation, it's the time to incorporate mom, dad, brother, grandma, share stories of them. I always think of it's how we live forever, is through these resurges of grief. It's our legacy is the living. And these resurges are a time to capitalize on, right? To bring that person's life into the fullness of what our life is now, or clinically what we would call continuing bonds. That's what continuing bonds looks like over the course of a lifetime. It's when these upsurges come, it's to capitalize on them and bring that person back to life, or incorporate them fully into your life. And Melinda, when you were talking about your daughter, it made me think of, I often use this term with grieving adults attached to a child, that telling of the death is very much an event with adults, right? You tell them, they get it, and they have the full brain capacity to start their grieving process and not need a lot more guidance, really, right? Support, but not guidance around what is death, what is this type of loss. But kids, it's such a process, and it's a developmental process. So it's drips and drabs over their development. And again, it's a time to capitalize on. It's not just the education, but and I'm sure you're doing this because you express yourself so beautifully as a grieving mom. It's just capitalizing it and letting that person be alive again. And it's really cool, right? It's painful. I mean, it's easy for me as a grief professional to say it's really cool, but it's also really painful.
But yeah, it is beautiful. It's beautiful. It's hard to kind of describe that feeling because it is, and it brings you closer to connection to the person who is gone. And even though it's painful, it's this kind of beautiful type of pain that you feel this connection to someone that you'll love forever. And that's definitely true for children as well.
Well, and you can really provide a great opportunity for kids to help you figure out how you want to celebrate that person. I mean, they love to be involved in creating a ritual or coming up with an idea that can help them stay connected, and involving them in those conversations and giving them a task or a job is a great way to help them develop the skills to do that all throughout their life.
Yeah, totally. It mitigates powerlessness, right? Like sometimes those surges make you feel so powerless. So nothing like a good old fashioned choice or job, right?
Exactly.
Well, the other thing that my students have taught me, because I teach a class at Siena called Death, Diversity, and Pop Culture, and we talk about how there are so many things out there in pop culture that provide teachable moments or opportunities for kids to process. So ask them what music they listen to when they're sad. And I mean, there is so much out there that kids connect with, and teenagers and adolescents, even adults. And the library, the public library, is filled with books in the kids and young adolescents section that deal with all kinds of death-related and loss-related topics. And I did a project years ago. I think I read about 104 YA books, and I still read them because they teach me what's out there. And now on Netflix and all the streaming services, there are some wonderful, but actually some pretty disturbing things that kids can watch. So I think we as professionals and parents have an obligation to kind of keep our eyes open on what the kids are reading. I remember when my daughter, we're on vacation in Maine, and I said, so what you reading? Because we had gone to the library in the town we visited, and she checked out a book called 13 Reasons Why. I hadn't heard of it at the time because it was right after it came out. I said, oh, what's that about? She tells me, and I about gasped because I couldn't believe my 13-year-old daughter was reading a book about suicide. And I thought, okay, I better pay more attention to what she's checking out from the library. But learned that it provided a great opportunity for us to have a conversation. So I think that's a whole nother area that parents and professionals should pay attention to, are these resources that are out there to help us have conversations. We just have to ask.
And we learned that from you, Carla. We do that all the time now, thanks to you, is ask kids about what music speaks their grief, what books. Tiff actually will co-read a book with kids if they suggest it, and we'll play the music in our groups now really from you, Carla. It's phenomenal. It's so cool.
Well, I have my students in my death and dying class for extra credit. They bring in a song that connects in any way to any topic we're going to talk about all semester. And every semester I teach this class, I learn, 10, 12 new songs that I wasn't aware of. So it's called, I call it playlisting grief. And if you go on Google and type playlists and death, playlist, grief, playlist, any word you can think of that relates to loss, you will find lists that people have compiled. So it's very easy to find them.
That's wonderful. Yeah, we did that after Dusty died. We made our own playlist of his favorite songs also, which is different than the children finding the songs that express their grief. But that's been another wonderful way to remember them. And because my children were so young, it gives them a chance to get to connect with him and get to know who he was, because they don't have much memory.
Well, check out the movie Mixtape. It's on one of the streaming services. It's about a young girl who finds a mixtape that her deceased, I think it was a parent, made, and she learns all about his life by tracking down these songs. It's a beautiful movie. I just saw it a couple months ago.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I will definitely check it out. I wanted to touch upon, before we finish up here, I wanted to just touch upon the way that different cultures and religions approach loss and grief. And this is something that I've spent a lot of time researching and learning about recently. And I was wondering, how do you incorporate cultural and religious differences in your work?
One of the pieces we ask people after this really cool training we had on culture and language and grief, even if they're speaking to us fluently in English, asking what language do they express their grief in, and then offering to have a translator there if they want, or if they want to express certain words or concepts in the language that best speaks their grief, to just do it. They don't to just express it the way it feels the best naturally to them. And then for cultural and religious implications, we always ask, what is pertinent to our work together. We do have a chaplain who's just phenomenal. So if we see there's a place or opportunity for that really specific subset of bereavement counseling, we will refer to our interfaith chaplain. And, we do a lot of ritual work with folks, which have just huge religious and cultural implications, right? So we really ask folks to what implications are best as we're guiding their ritual development. And it's the coolest things in the world. It's the coolest things. I know that was a very broad answer, but it's hard to go into each specific, but we try to, with each person, to take them from their context that feels the most comfortable culturally, religiously, language-wise, and weave in that way.
Yeah, that's
well, I've learned over time too that a lot of my students don't have a formal religious affiliation. So making sure to use the word spirituality and helping people to think about what that means, because spirituality is really just how we define what makes our life filled with meaning and purpose. And I think sometimes if kids don't have a church affiliation, they might not know how to answer that question. And so I think helping them to broaden the way they think about that is also really important.
And that's why creating rituals together can be a really powerful experience. And loss is one of those times in life when a child or a teen who's really in this developmental stage can come into contact with their own beliefs and understanding of loss and life after death and all those big questions that many of us grapple with. There's really no running away from it when you lose someone you love.
And it's a fascinating, at least for me, dichotomy of giving that concrete death-specific language to kids and allowing them to play with an afterlife or religious or spiritual belief set, right? Because both, they don't always match well for understanding a loss, and yet they're both so healthy and normative developmentally.
Absolutely. It's, the young child, it's so hard for them to understand. And our son is now just turning 4. And so he's had a lot of questions and trying to speak in those clear, direct terms about what happens when the person's body dies. But then we do have spiritual beliefs. So being clear about what happens with the body, but then the spirit, it's a lot for a little one to take on. But I think that if you just start to build that picture for them, then they are able to connect with it however they will.
And you'll see kids layer it. They'll start pantomiming or playing in that way. I was explaining death to my 3-year-old after she asked me, right? And I explained, the heart stops working, the body stops working, you can't play or eat. So she immediately starts laying down and going, blah. If you can't see me, but I stuck out my tongue and put my arms out. And she's like, I'm dead. My heart doesn't work anymore. And that can be really intense for a grieving guardian or grieving adult to see. Super normal. But that's like the next layer of integrating that knowledge. It's you hear it verbally. And for that age range, the next layer is then playing it, acting it out, having their dolls and their stuffed animals die. Really good and normal, and that's that integration piece for them. But holy moly, as the guardian attached to it, it's not it's not the easiest thing.
Right. Well, I remember I've taught about this, I've learned about this, I've worked with kids, but when my daughter was dealing with death for the first time, it was terrifying for me. And I will never forget our next door neighbor passed away very suddenly, and she was a little over 2, but my kid has always been 2 going on 30, right? So I wasn't sure how much she would be able to understand because she was so young. And I remember so vividly 2 lessons that I learned. I was going to go next door to talk to our neighbor's widow and just find out what happened, because his daughter met me in the driveway when I was coming home from work and told me that her father had suddenly passed away. So I walked into the house. I told my husband very quickly what was happening and said, I need to go talk to Ronnie or Veronica. And Gwen said, want to go see them. And I'm like, okay, what do I do? She was so insistent. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to take her with me. And I was terrified of what was going to happen. But what was so beautiful, this little tiny kid, when she saw his wife crying and me hugging her, she took one arm and wrapped her arm around my leg and one arm around her leg and just gave us a hug. And then 2 seconds later, she's asking where he was, which of course was kind of a nightmare. But she said, Carla, she needs to just look for him and discover he's not here. And so I think being comfortable and confident that you'll be able to handle whatever gets thrown in your path, as long as you're honest and you use language that they'll understand and know that, hey, they might not get it the first time and you might have to repeat 1,000,000 times that he's died. As Tiffany was talking to us, just not being terrified that you're going to do something wrong, because kids are very understanding and resilient. And I think you just have to go with it and be willing to try your best. The other thing that I learned is that sometimes kids understand a heck of a lot more than we give them credit for, because I did exactly what Sierra did. I said his heart stopped working, he stopped breathing, and he's not coming back. And then the next day, he got sick very suddenly, blah, blah, blah. The next day I say, innocently, I'm going to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription. She's like, Mommy, are you sick? And you can guess what was going through her head. Are you going to die too? So it's like, oh, geez, they put things together in ways that you can't even imagine sometimes. So I think we just have to be very aware that kids are really smart and they pick up on everything that's going on. So you owe it to them to be honest and forthcoming, because they're going to know something's up. People act differently when they're grieving, and if you try to protect them from it, sometimes I think that does more harm than good.
Yeah, protection can be exclusion, right? Mm-hmm. And what we need is that community and that wraparound love.
Absolutely. And then we're teaching them how to grieve and how to respond when loss happens. So bringing them in the fold and including them in age-appropriate ways is really positive and will help set them up for a more nuanced relationship with loss as they grow older. Thank you so much for your time today. I just wanted to ask for the listeners to let them know what about the grief services that are available at the community hospice.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. So we have free grief counseling for our community, no matter how a loss has happened, whether you're on our hospice program or the loss has happened more suddenly in the community. And we have individual counseling, group counseling for all age ranges. We have our snazzy grief camp. Camp Erin Albany is going to be running in September in person. It'll be a day camp. So if you're interested, just feel free to go on our website, hospicegriefservices.com. You can apply online or give us a call at 518-724-0200. We're here. We're free. We're a lot of fun, as I hope you could tell.
Great. Thank you so much. And Professor Sofka, how can our listeners find you so they can follow your work?
Well, if they're interested in accessing the resource about netiquette that I talked about before, there's a PDF file attached to my faculty webpage. So if they look me up, CARLA, Carla Sofka, S as in Sam, O, F as in Frank, KA, at Siena. Just go Google my name and Siena and put in the word netiquette, NETIQUETTE. It'll pop right up in Google. And there are some additional information about my work on that website, and they can find my email address if they want to reach out that way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here and for being part of this.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure to share what I've learned.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks for having us.